Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where the Trump administration is facing increased political and economic pressure to end the war against Iran amid a new stunning admission by the president this afternoon that he's not considering the financial impact to Americans as the war drives up prices. Right now, President Trump is on his way to Beijing, where he's set to meet with the Chinese President Xi. While departing the White House, the president was asked about the economic impact the war is having here at home as energy prices soar and inflation ticks up. He was defiant in his answer and was even given an opportunity to clean up his comments, but he doubled down. Take a look.
When you're negotiating with Iran, Mr. President, to what extent are Americans' financial situations motivating you to make a deal?
Not even a little bit. The only thing that matters when I'm talking about Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. That's all.
Did you say earlier that the only thing that matters to you when it comes to Iran is a nuclear weapon? You're not considering the financial impact of this war on Americans?
The most important thing by far, including whether our stock market, which, by the way, is at an all-time high, but including whether or not our stock market goes up or down a little bit, the most important thing by far is Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Now, this all comes amid more evidence that the war is adding to voters' economic anxieties, with a new report from the Labor Department showing that consumer prices are up 3.8% compared to last year, and it's largely driven by rising energy prices. President Trump was asked about that report today. Take a look.
Mr. President, you promised to bring inflation down. It's now at its highest level in 3 years. Are your policies not working?
No,
What's
my
happening?
policies are working incredibly. If you go back to just before the war, for the last 3 months, inflation was at 1.7%. Now, we had a choice. Let these lunatics have a nuclear weapon. If you want to do that, then you're a stupid person. It's a very simple message. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and they won't have a nuclear weapon, and that's 100%.
It comes as new polling shows the president significantly underwater with the public on several key issues, including gas prices, inflation, and the economy. And a majority of Americans across the political spectrum saying his policies have increased the cost of living in their communities. Meanwhile, there are a few signs that the conflict with Iran will be over anytime soon. And the president today offered little in the way of clarity about the path ahead.
At what point are you done negotiating with Iran?
Well, we're going to see what happens. We're only making a good deal. We have their military is gone. It's wiped out. And we're only going to make a good deal, and we'll see what happens.
Mr. President, what is going to be your red line to end the ceasefire for you? What will it take to pull the plug?
Well, we're going to see, and we'll be thinking about it on the flight, and we'll be thinking about it for the next little while. But we've beaten their militaries very soundly. That's over with. The blockade is very effective. It's been 100% effective. And one way or the other, it's going to work out very well.
All right, let's talk about it. Joining me now, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba and NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, as well as NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Mel Zanona. Let's start with you, Monica. You were there on the South Lawn where the president made that comment about the economic concerns of Americans. Is the White House trying to clean this comment up at all? What's the reaction been about the president's comments about inflation and the economy in general?
Yeah, not cleaning it up at all, Ryan. If anything, maybe leaning into it and trying to emphasize what the president was. And he was, as you pointed out, given an opportunity kind of in real time a few moments later to clarify, because that sentence really stood out in real time. The president of the United States saying that he doesn't think about Americans' financial situations when he's talking about whether to make a deal with Iran is something that you're going to be probably hearing a lot about from critics, from Democrats in this midterm season. So setting that aside, the president was asked again, is that exactly what you meant? And he completely doubled down on that. And then when I went to the White House and asked them if they wanted to clarify or add some more context to that answer, Stephen Cheung, a White House spokesman here, did tell me that the president's ultimate responsibility, he says, is the safety and security of Americans. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and if action wasn't taken, they'd have one, which threatens all Americans. So again, trying to really put this on a national security framework in terms of the conversation. But Ryan, remember that for weeks and weeks, the president, when he has been asked overall about the pain that Americans are feeling, not just at the pump, but on some of these overall rising prices, he has said that it is basically a worthy price to pay for Iran not to have a nuclear weapon. And he has even gone on to say that Americans should be more grateful to him for the work he says he is doing to try to ensure that.
Yeah, and Monica, maybe the president isn't thinking about the financial toll that this war is taking on the average American, but the American public certainly is. I mean, when you look at these latest poll numbers, they show the president underwater on his handling of several issues. That includes gas prices, the inflation, and the economy. We're also seeing the war drive up inflation. I mean, and this isn't a small margin. These are huge numbers in terms of the reaction that people are having to this. How is the White House reacting to these latest data points?
Yeah, they are pretty dismissive of the idea that it is the president's own policies that are making these issues worse. Remember that just a couple of days ago, there was a pretty good jobs report that came out, and the White House was definitely touting that and leaning into that. And so you do have a little bit of a selective decision from the White House when there are economic indicators that they feel are very positive. They want to talk about those nonstop. But you can't ignore the context and the backdrop to all of that. But they dismiss and sort of set that aside. And that is what the president did today, specifically on these very sticky inflation numbers that you're continuing to see. The president says it's not his policies when, of course, we know and we are seeing a lot more evidence of the specific prices of oil and gas that have contributed to this, the energy costs overall. But the president says that that is worthy. He says Americans should really absorb that. He says in the short term, but that's the real question here too, Ryan, is that it's unclear how long this is going to last. And even if this war were to come to an official end and the hostilities were completely over and the Strait of Hormuz was all set, it would still take a lot of time potentially for consumers to start to feel those prices easing.
All right, Monica Alba, thank you for that, and thank you for your dogged reporting there on the South Lawn. That opens up the opportunity to bring Courtney into the conversation, because what the president says over and over again, Courtney, is as soon as this war is over, all these concerns we have about the economy are going to go away. The price of oil is going to collapse, he's described it. Inflation will go away. But there's little evidence that we're anywhere near the end of this war. And you have some new reporting about how the administration would resume combat operations if the ceasefire collapses, which we should remind our viewers the president said yesterday is on as a 1% chance of survival. He described it as being on life support. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and we don't have any indication at this point that, in fact, the president has made the decision to restart some sort of major combat operations. But should he do so, the U.S. military still has a huge presence there in the Middle East. In fact, they've even brought in additional capabilities since the ceasefire began. And we've learned, according to two U.S. officials, that, in fact, there is some planning that would involve renaming it from Operation Epic Fury to Operation Sledgehammer, if, in fact, they were to restart it. And part of the reason for that is because then they could restart in a whole new mission. It would restart the 60-day clock for the War Powers Act and give the president a little bit more breathing room if he were to decide to really go forward with an extended combat operation again against Iran.
There might be some members of Congress that would quibble with this idea that the clock restarts, but regardless, that is something that the White House...
It's been a question all along,
yes,
whether the ceasefire actually represented that as
yes,
well.
Exactly. But let's talk more about the cost of this war. We now have a new adjusted price. It's now up to $29 billion. That's up $4 billion from just a few weeks ago. Do we know why it's costing so much more?
Especially since it's been during a ceasefire that cost has gone up by $4 billion. So according to the acting comptroller for the Pentagon, he testified on the Hill today. He said that it's a combination of figuring out exactly how much it's going to cost to replace certain things. The cost has gone up in the meantime as they've done additional calculations. There's also the continuing U.S. military presence in the region, so that's costing money. I mean, what's really unclear here, and we did not get an answer in the hearings today, is does the blockade factor into that? Is that one thing that's costing additional money? money. One thing we did learn, though, and this is very critical, that number is absolutely going to increase, because not only has it increased $4 billion in these last 2 weeks, but that $29 billion does not include the cost to fix bases throughout the region that were damaged by Iranian strikes throughout the course of the war. We know that, in fact, there was extensive damage to several different bases in the region that could cost in the neighborhood of millions and probably billions of dollars.
Okay, Courtney Kube, thanks for that. Let's turn now to Capitol Hill, and that's where Melanie Zanona is standing by. I have to imagine, Melanie, there were a lot of Democrats that heard those comments and probably called up their political consultants and told them to cut ads as soon as possible to be run in the upcoming midterms. What's the reaction going to be like on the Hill to the president's comments when we hear these members of Congress say over and over and over again that the economy is going to be the dominating issue in the upcoming midterms?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ryan. You can already imagine the ads that are being cut on behalf of Democrats with those comments. But for Republicans, especially moderate Republicans in vulnerable races, they have been begging the president to focus on affordability issues. And this is the opposite of that. Not only is it not focusing on affordability issues, it is downright dismissing those very real concerns of so many constituents around the country. And so the White House, their view is that there's still time to turn things around, that this is only temporary. But comments like these are offering very little assurance to these already very nervous Republicans on Capitol Hill. So certainly behind the scenes, we're already hearing some grumbling from Republicans. We'll see whether any of them come out publicly against the president, or if they try to put some more affordability issues actually on the floor in the House and Senate. That's something that's been an ongoing conversation. But no doubt, comments like these, not helpful for Republicans.
And let's get back to this issue that we were talking to Courtney about this 60-day clock that the White House assumingly thinks that they can just restart. We saw the secretary on the Hill again today. Where are lawmakers right now when it comes to the war? Is there an appetite for it to continue, especially given the economic fallout? And do we anticipate at any point that Republicans in particular will force this issue of getting congressional approval around this 60-day limit?
Well, I will say broadly, Republicans are still supportive of the war and of the president. But it's pretty clear, both from the hearing today and in my conversations with Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, that it is going to be a difficult task trying to get a supplemental war funding package through the House. They're going to need votes in the Senate from Democrats. Democrats very opposed to this. But even Republicans in the hearing today had a lot of questions about that price tag, which the Pentagon comptroller said today was now nearing $29 billion. Meanwhile, Secretary Hegseth, he was quite combative when he was pressed on this question, repeatedly refusing to say what he would request or if he would request it, when he would request it on an emergency basis. And so they concluded the hearing, both the top Democrat and Republican on this key appropriations committee, urging him to submit his request as soon as possible, saying the sooner we get it, the sooner we can start working on it and getting through Congress. A real acknowledgement that it's not necessarily going to be an easy feat. And then to your question of whether they're going to force this issue, Democrats have repeatedly forced these resolutions to try to rein in Trump's war powers. Those have failed repeatedly. But in talking to some senior House GOP sources, they say they cannot beat back those efforts forever, especially if the war drags on, Ryan.
Okay, Melanie Zanona, great reporting on Capitol Hill. We appreciate it. And as we mentioned, prices for consumers keep ticking up, rising 3.8% in April compared to last year, according to the latest CPI report. The increase driven largely by a spike in energy prices due to the war. Overall, inflation was in line with expectations, but it still marks the highest rate in 3 years. Joining me now is NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Cheung. So, Brian, take us through this latest inflation report. What does it say about the health of the economy, and which categories are seeing the highest rise in inflation?
Yeah, well, these numbers, Ryan, confirm what we've been reporting on the last few months, which is that this is an inflationary environment that is due in part to the war with Iran. So, again, as you mentioned, 3.8%. That's how much prices rose in April of this year compared to April of last year. That's a faster pace than the 3.3%. And it's also the highest number and highest reading we've seen on inflation since May of 3 years ago. Now, when we take a look again at the overall picture of these yearly rates over time, you can see that uptick. That's certainly concerning, not just for the president, but also for the Federal Reserve that's trying to balance not just this, but also a slowing jobs market. But I think that, again, you have to remember that the big reason for why that headline number was so high is, of course, because of the spiking cost of gasoline. The current average right now, $4.50 at a national level. In many states, it's already higher than that. Fuel oil up over 50% in the last year, and airline fares up over 20%. Again, the idea here is that inflation could get even worse for things like food, as well as plastic packaging, because of the fact that polyethylene comes from the Strait of Hormuz as well. So it's just kind of a reminder that what we're seeing as a gas and fuel bump could become an overall inflationary story for other categories in the months to come as well, Ryan.
And then, Brian, there's also just the feeling Americans have, right? And what we saw, again, was that inflation outpaced wage growth. So it's one thing for prices to go up, but if your pocketbook doesn't match that, what does that mean for workers and consumers?
Yeah, and that was something where even despite the fact that the inflationary numbers have been ticking up as of the last few months, that, all right, we were saying the good news, though, is that wages were still outpacing inflation. If your wallet is growing at a faster pace than the price tags at the store, that's still relatively okay. What you're worried about is when that flips, and it just flipped in this report. As we mentioned, 3.8%, that's how much prices rose in this country. But the jobs report, which you got last week, showed average hourly earnings only up by 3.6%. So this is negative for the first time in about 3 years. And that is of major concern because that real fuel affordability was already an issue before we started to get these statistics. This is going to be worse because, again, if inflation is higher than wages, that is eroding from your savings. Things at the store are getting more expensive than you're getting pay raises at work. That is very much of concern. And we'll see if this trend holds in the months to come, Ryan.
Okay, that's pretty bottom line for most Americans. Brian Cheung, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.